The last train I take home has fewer passengers each night, but it never feels empty. I've been taking the 11:47 from Houston for just over 3 months now. That's how long I've been working the late shift at the archive. Since September, when Davies went on medical leave and never came back. They needed someone to cover, and I needed the overtime. So I said yes without thinking too hard about what it would mean. What it means is this: 5 nights a week I walk through a mostly empty station, tap my Oyster card, and board a train that takes me 42 minutes north to a town that's not quite suburbia and not quite countryside. It's the last service of the night. After this one, the boards go dark and the platforms close. For the first few weeks, I didn't notice anything. That's the truth. When you're tired, really tired, the kind of tired that makes your eyes feel like they've been packed in sand, you don't pay attention to much. You sit down, you put your bag between your feet, you lean your head against the window, and you wait. The rhythm of the train does the rest. It empties your mind, just gently, until the 42 minutes feel like 15. Then you're home. Then you're in bed. Then the alarm goes, and you do it all over again. There were maybe 15 or 20 passengers on the train when I first started. I never counted them exactly. That number is more of a feeling. The sense of a carriage that was occupied but quiet. A few heads visible above the seatbacks. Someone with earbuds in. A woman near the front who always had a paperback. A man in a reflective vest who I assumed was coming off a construction job. The usual last train population. People who, like me, had reasons to be heading home at an hour when most reasonable people were already asleep. I sat in the same seat every night, the rear of the second carriage, window side, facing backwards. I liked watching the station pull away from me, rather than rushing toward the next one. Something about it felt less urgent. I put my phone on silent, closed my eyes for a few stops, and opened them again when the automated voice said, Hemel Hempstead, which was 2 stops before mine. That was my routine. That was all of it. It was ordinary. The first thing I noticed, and I didn't even register it as something to notice at the time, was the quiet. Not silence. There's a difference. Silence is the absence of sound, and a train is never truly silent. There's always the thrum of the tracks, the hiss of air between carriages, the occasional creak of a seat as someone shifts their weight. What I mean is that the human noise dropped off. The small sounds that people make, a cough, a zipper being pulled, the soft tap of someone scrolling on their phone, the papery rustle of the woman turning a page. I couldn't have told you when it started. It was more like waking up one morning and realizing the tree outside your window has lost most of its leaves. You didn't see them fall. You just look up one day and the branches are nearly bare, and you think, that happened. One night in early October, I opened my eyes at Hemel Hempstead and looked around the carriage out of habit. I counted 6 people. That seemed low. It was a Wednesday, and Wednesdays had always felt like one of the fuller nights, though I couldn't tell you why. I thought about it for a moment, the way you think about anything mildly curious. A headline you skim, a price that seems higher than you remember. And then I let it go. The next night there were 5. Again, I didn't find this alarming. People get ill, shifts change. Someone buys a car or moves to a different town. The population of a late-night train is not a stable thing. It fluctuates. I knew that. I told myself that, and it was a perfectly reasonable thing to tell myself. But I'd started counting. That was the change. Without making any conscious decision to do so, I'd begun noting how many people were in the carriage when I boarded, and how many were left by the time I reached my stop. It became part of the routine, the way checking your watch becomes part of the routine, even when you already know what time it is. You just do it because your brain wants the data. Thursday, 4 passengers. Friday, 4 again, but not the same 4. I knew this because on Thursday, one of them had been wearing a long gray coat, and on Friday, no one was wearing a long gray coat. These are the kinds of details that mean nothing until they start to mean something. I didn't ride on weekends. Saturday and Sunday, I stayed home, ate badly, slept too much, and tried to convince myself that the overtime was worth it. On Monday, I went back. I tapped in, walked to the second carriage, sat in my seat. 3 people. The man in the reflective vest was gone. The woman with the paperback was gone. In fact, I realized I hadn't seen her in over a week. The 3 passengers who remained were strangers to me. No, not strangers exactly. I'd seen them before. In the peripheral way you see anyone on a regular commute. You don't know their name or their face, but you know their shape, the space they take up. One was a young man with a backpack who sat near the doors. One was an older woman who always faced forward and kept her hands folded in her lap, very still. The third was someone in a dark jacket who sat several rows ahead of me on the opposite side, and whose face I had never once seen clearly. 3 people. The carriage was emptier than I had ever seen it, and it was Monday and it was only 11:30, and Houston had been reasonably busy when I walked through. I remember thinking, where is everyone? But I also remember thinking something else, something quieter, that I almost didn't catch. I was looking at the 3 remaining passengers and at the rows and rows of empty seats between them, and the thought that surfaced was not that the carriage felt empty, it was that it didn't. That's a strange thing to think when you can count every person in the space on one hand, but it was true, or it felt true, which at the time seemed like the same thing. The air in the carriage had a kind of weight to it, not warm, not cold, just occupied, like a room after a party when the guests have left but the atmosphere hasn't caught up yet. There was a density to the emptiness that didn't match what my eyes were telling me. I put it down to tiredness. I put everything down to tiredness in those days. It's a convenient explanation and usually a correct one. Tuesday, 3 passengers again, the same 3. I was almost sure of it. Wednesday, 2. The young man with the backpack wasn't there. I walked the length of the carriage before sitting down, which I'd never done before, and I pretended I was looking for a better seat. I wasn't. I was looking for him. He wasn't there. 2 passengers. The older woman with the folded hands, the figure in the dark jacket, and me. I sat down. The train pulled away. Here's what I want to say about that night, because this is when things shifted in a way I can't quite undo. The carriage was emptier than ever. 2 other people, and one of them was rows and rows ahead of me, barely visible. By every measure, this should have felt like solitude, like being alone in a large, poorly lit room that happened to be moving at 70 miles an hour. But it didn't feel like solitude. It felt like the opposite. I was aware, and this is the only way I can describe it, of presence. Not a specific presence, not a figure I could see or a sound I could trace. Just the vague, insistent sense that the empty seats around me were not as empty as they looked. It was the feeling you get in a dark house when you're sure you're alone, but you still close the bathroom door. Not because you think someone is there, but because something in you isn't convinced. I stared at the reflection in the window. My own face stared back, pale and slightly distorted by the curve of the glass. Behind my reflection, the interior of the carriage stretched out in a long, darkened mirror image. Seat backs, overhead lights, the aisle. Everything was still. Everything was exactly as it should have been. But I kept looking. I kept looking because some part of my brain, some old pre-verbal part that doesn't deal in logic, was telling me that if I looked long enough, I would see something in that reflection that wasn't in the carriage itself. I didn't see anything. I turned away from the window and stared at my hands and rode the rest of the way home in a state of alert discomfort that I could not justify to myself. The next night I did something I'd never done before. I arrived at Euston early, 20 minutes early, and I stood on the platform and watched the other passengers. I wanted to see who was getting on this train. I wanted to see how many people walked down the platform and stepped through the doors and took their seats, so that I could compare that number to the number I found inside. 7 people boarded. I counted carefully. A couple holding hands, a man in a suit who was on his phone, a teenager with headphones, the older woman with the folded hands, a tall person in a gray hoodie, and me. That's 6 in me, 7 total. I boarded last. I walked through the first carriage and into the second. I sat in my seat, and before the train had even started to move, I looked around and counted. 4. The older woman, the person in the dark jacket, who was already seated even though I hadn't seen them board. And two others I didn't recognize. 4, not 7. I had watched 7 people board this train, and now there were 4. The couple was gone. The man in the suit was gone. The teenager was gone. The tall person in the gray hoodie was gone. I told myself they were in the first carriage, or the third. Obviously, people don't vanish between the platform and the seat. They were elsewhere on the train, and I was being ridiculous, and I was tired, and I should close my eyes and stop. But I didn't close my eyes. I sat there and I felt the weight of the air around me, and I listened. The train was making all the sounds it always made. Track noise, the hiss of hydraulics, the distant automated voice reading station names in its flat, patient tone. But underneath those sounds, in the spaces between them, there was something else. Not a sound exactly, more like the ghost of a sound. The suggestion of breath that wasn't mine, of weight shifting in a seat that I could see was empty. I turned my head slowly to the left. The row across the aisle from me was vacant. I could see the seat cushion, the armrest, the faded blue pattern of the upholstery. There was nothing there. But the seat was slightly compressed. I stared at it. The cushion had a shallow indentation, as if someone had just been sitting there, or as if someone was sitting there right now and I simply couldn't see them. I looked away. I looked back. The indentation was gone. The cushion was flat and smooth and exactly as you'd expect an empty seat to be. I think that was the first night I didn't sleep when I got home. I lay in bed with the light on and stared at the ceiling and tried to find the version of reality where everything I'd experienced had a normal explanation. Tired eyes, dim lighting, old cushions that retained shape. All of these things were possible. All of them were likely, even. But there was a feeling lodged behind my ribs like a splinter, and no amount of reasoning could work it loose. The next night was Friday. I almost didn't go. I stood at my front door with my coat on and my keys in my hand, and I almost called in sick. But I didn't because the archive doesn't cover itself, and because I needed the money, and because I was not going to become someone who was afraid of a train. I took the 1147. 2 passengers, the older woman with the folded hands and the figure in the dark jacket. They were seated in their usual positions, as if they'd been there for hours, as if the train had formed around them. I sat down. The train left the station. I want to tell you about the older woman because I'd been watching her more closely by then, and certain things had begun to bother me. She was always there. Every single night, she was already on the train when I boarded, and she was still on the train when I got off. She never moved. Her hands stayed folded in her lap, her posture stayed perfectly straight, and she faced forward with the kind of absolute stillness that you don't usually see in a living person. Not rigid, not tense, just still, the way a photograph is still. I'd never seen her face. She sat several rows ahead of me, always facing away, and I'd never had a reason to walk past her. Her hair was gray and neatly pinned. She wore the same dark blue coat every time. Her shoes were sensible, flat, dark. Everything about her was ordinary, and nothing about her felt right. That Friday, I did something I immediately regretted. As the train slowed for the first stop after Euston, I stood up. I told myself I was stretching my legs. I walked forward down the aisle, slowly, steadying myself against the seat backs as the train decelerated. I got within 3 rows of her. And then I stopped because the air changed. I don't know how else to put it. The temperature didn't drop. There was no cold spot, no sudden chill, nothing so dramatic. It was more like the air became thicker, as if I were walking into a space that was already full of what I couldn't say. But every step closer to her felt like pushing against something that didn't want me there. She didn't turn around. She didn't move at all. Her hands stayed folded. Her back stayed straight. I went back to my seat. At my stop, I stood up and walked toward the doors. I had to pass her row to get there. As I did, I glanced to my left just quickly, just a flicker of a look, and I saw her hands. They were folded in her lap, just as they always were, but her fingers were interlaced too tightly. The knuckles were white, and the skin on the backs of her hands was smooth, completely smooth. Not aged, not wrinkled, not mottled. Smooth like wax, like the skin of someone who had never been old and was only wearing old the way you'd wear a coat. I got off the train. I stood on the platform and watched the doors close and the train pull away, and through the window I could see her sitting in exactly the same position, not having moved, not having breathed as far as I could tell. I didn't sleep that night either. Over the weekend, I tried to make sense of it. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold 3 times, and I wrote down everything I'd noticed. The declining passengers, the feeling of presence, the compressed seat cushion, the woman's hands, the figure in the dark jacket whose face I'd never seen. When I wrote it all down, it looked like nothing. It looked like the scattered observations of a tired, anxious person who was spending too much time on a train and not enough time sleeping. I could almost hear someone reading it back to me in a gentle, concerned voice and saying, "Mate, you need a holiday." But there was one thing I couldn't reason away, and it was this. 7 people had boarded the train and only 4 had been inside. Not eventually, not after a few stops, immediately. The numbers didn't match, and they hadn't matched since I'd started counting. On Monday, I was back. The platform was quiet. I counted the passengers who boarded, 5 including me. Inside the carriage there were 3, the older woman, the figure in the dark jacket, and 1 other person, a middle-aged man I didn't recognize, sitting near the front with his eyes closed. 2 people from the platform had not made it into the carriage. I want to be precise about this. I don't mean they got off. I don't mean they walked to another car. I stood at the rear of the second carriage and I had a clear view of the aisle in both directions, and no one walked past me. The couple who had boarded ahead of me, a woman with a red scarf and a younger man carrying a takeaway bag, had stepped onto this train and then ceased to be on it. They had entered the system and the system had absorbed them. I sat down. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against my thighs and breathed through my nose and tried to steady myself. And then I felt it. Someone sat down next to me. I was looking straight ahead. I had a clear view of the seat beside me in my peripheral vision, and it was empty, but the cushion compressed. I felt the tilt of it, the slight lean of the seat frame as weight settled into it. And the air on my left side became dense in a way that air should not be dense. Warm, close, as if a body were there, inches from mine, breathing quietly, settling in for the ride. I didn't turn my head. I want you to understand that. I did not turn my head. Not because I was brave, and not because I was paralyzed, but because I understood. In a way that bypassed thought entirely and went straight to something deeper, that I was not supposed to look. That whatever had sat down beside me existed in a space that was adjacent to seeing, and that to turn and look directly at it would be a violation of something I couldn't name. A rule I hadn't been told but knew anyway. I sat very still. The presence beside me sat very still. The train moved through the dark, and we rode together in silence. At the first stop, the middle-aged man near the front got off. I watched him stand and walk to the doors and step onto the platform. He was real. He moved like a real person, with the slight stiffness of someone who'd been sitting too long. The doors closed behind him. 3 of us now. Me, the older woman, and the figure in the dark jacket, plus whatever was sitting beside me. The feeling didn't leave. It stayed for the entire ride. 42 minutes of sitting next to something I couldn't see, feeling the heat of it, the weight of it, the way it displaced the air. Once, about 20 minutes in, I thought I heard it exhale. A long, slow breath, like someone settling into sleep. It was so close that I almost felt it on my neck. Almost. Not quite. Always just below the threshold of certainty. When the train reached my stop, I stood up. The presence beside me did not. I walked to the doors and I got off and I stood on the platform in the cold October air, and I shook for 5 solid minutes before I could make my legs carry me home. I called in sick on Tuesday. I sat in my flat and I did not turn on the television and I did not open my laptop and I did not do anything except sit in the quiet and think. Because the thing that was bothering me, the thing that was really truly bothering me, was not the presence. It was not the woman with the waxy hands or the figure in the dark jacket or the vanishing passengers. It was this. The train didn't feel empty. It should have. Night after night, the passengers were dwindling. The seats were increasingly vacant. By any objective measure, the carriage was emptying out. But it didn't feel that way. It felt fuller. Each night there was more presence, not less, as if the people who disappeared were not actually leaving but changing state, transitioning from visible to invisible, from countable to uncountable. They were still there. All of them were still there. They had simply stopped being the kind of thing you could see. I went back on Wednesday. I know how that sounds. But the alternative was losing the job. And the alternative to that was losing the flat. And the alternative to that was a chain of consequences I didn't want to follow to its end. So I went back. I told myself I would sit in a different carriage. I told myself I would put my headphones in and close my eyes and not count anyone and not look at anyone and just ride the 42 minutes home like a normal person. I boarded the first carriage. I sat in the front row, as far from my usual seat as possible. The doors closed. The train moved. I was alone in the carriage, completely alone, not a single other passenger. And the carriage was full. I don't know how to make you understand this if you haven't felt it. The seats were empty. The aisle was clear. The overhead lights hummed in their usual flat, fluorescent way, and every surface was visible and unoccupied. But the space was full. It was packed. It was standing room only with something I couldn't perceive, and the air was so thick with presence that I could barely breathe. I felt them, dozens of them, maybe more, sitting in every seat, standing in the aisle, leaning against the doors. I couldn't see a single one, but I could feel their weight in the floor, their warmth in the air, the faint disturbance of their breathing. They were all around me. They were pressed against me. They were so close that I should have been able to touch them. And when I reached out my hand, I don't know why I did this. It was involuntary, my body reaching for proof. My fingers passed through empty air that felt like it was already occupied. I pulled my hand back and I held it against my chest, and I rode the rest of the way home without moving. That night, lying in bed, I tried to figure out the math. If there had been 15 or 20 passengers when I started in September, and they dwindled to 2 or 3 visible ones over the course of 5 weeks, then where were the rest? If they weren't leaving, if they were still on the train, but simply no longer visible, then the 1147 was carrying a growing number of passengers that only I seemed to notice were missing. The visible population was shrinking. The invisible one was growing. And the feeling of fullness was increasing in direct proportion to the number of empty seats. Something was collecting them, or something was changing them, or they had always been like this. Invisible, present, packed into the space between what you see and what you feel. And the visible passengers had been the anomaly all along. Maybe what I was witnessing was not a disappearance, but a correction. The train returning to its natural state, full of things that don't need to be seen. I didn't like that thought. I didn't like it because it raised an obvious question, which was, how long before it corrected me? On Thursday, I boarded the train, and there was only one visible passenger left, the figure in the dark jacket. The older woman was gone. I stood in the doorway of the second carriage and I looked at the figure, and the figure sat perfectly still, 5 rows ahead of me, on the left side of the aisle. Dark jacket, hood up, hands not visible, face turned toward the window. I sat down in my usual seat. The train was so full of invisible presence that I could feel it pressing against my shoulders, my arms, my legs. It was like being in a crowd. The warmth of bodies, the micro movements, the displaced air, all of it without a single visible source. And then the figure in the dark jacket did something it had never done before. It turned around, slowly, so slowly that at first I thought I was imagining it. The hood rotated degree by degree until it was no longer facing the window, but facing the aisle. And then it continued turning, past the aisle toward the back of the carriage, toward me. I couldn't see the face. The hood was deep, and the lighting was bad, and the distance between us was too great for detail. But I could see the shape of the hood, the dark oval where the face should have been, and it was aimed directly at me. We stayed like that. The train rocked gently on the tracks. The automated voice announced a station. The doors opened and closed. No one got on. No one got off. The figure turned back to the window. I got off at my stop. My legs were numb and my chest was tight, and I could taste something metallic at the back of my throat. I walked home in the cold and I locked my door, and I sat on the floor of my hallway because I couldn't make it any further into the flat. Friday, the last working day of that week. I stood on the platform at Euston and I watched the train arrive. It was the same train. Same model, same livery, same number on the board. The doors opened with their familiar hiss. The platform was empty, except for me. I looked through the windows of the carriages as the train sat idling. Every seat was empty. Every aisle was clear. The fluorescent lights made the interior look flat and sterile, like a hospital corridor. I did not want to get on that train, but I got on. The second I stepped through the doors, the fullness hit me like a wall. The carriage was heaving with presence. It was the most crowded space I had ever been in, and I couldn't see a single occupant. The air was warm and close and smelled faintly of wool and skin and something underneath those things. Something older, like the smell of a room that's been closed up for a very long time. The figure in the dark jacket was not there. Not visibly, but as I walked to my seat, I felt them everywhere. Not one figure. Many. Many figures in dark jackets. Many older women with folded hands. Many young men with backpacks. Many women with paperbacks. All of them present. All of them riding the 1147, just as they always had. They had never left. They had simply stopped being visible, one by one, like lights going out along a corridor. I sat down. The seat beside me compressed immediately. The seat in front of me creaked. I heard, actually heard, the faint rustle of a page turning, somewhere to my right where there was no one. The train pulled out of the station. And this is what I need to tell you because this is the part I keep coming back to. As the train moved through the dark and I sat among passengers I couldn't see, I felt something I didn't expect. I felt comfortable. Not safe, but that's not the right word. But comfortable. The way you feel when you've been in a place so many times that your body knows it even when your mind is screaming. My shoulders relaxed, my breathing slowed. The presence around me, thick and warm and impossible, began to feel less like a threat and more like company. I recognized them, not with my eyes but with something else, the sense memory of proximity. I knew who was sitting beside me by the way the air moved. I knew the man in the reflective vest by the faint chemical smell that clung to his clothes. I knew the woman with the paperback by the steady rhythmic sound of her breathing, slow and deep like someone reading. I knew the older woman by the absolute stillness of her presence, the way the air around her didn't move at all. They were all there. Every passenger I'd watched disappear over the past 5 weeks was on that train, sitting in their usual seats, riding the route they'd always ridden. The only thing that had changed was that I could no longer see them. And then a thought occurred to me that made the comfort drain away like water from a tub. I could no longer see them, but they could see me. They could all see me. I was certain of it. I was the one being watched now. I was the visible one, sitting in my seat in the second carriage, the last remaining point of light in a space that had gone dark. I was what they looked at during the ride. I was the interesting one, the one who still had a shape, a face, a body that reflected light. How long had they been watching me? Since the beginning? Had they been watching me even before they disappeared? Back when I could see them too? Back when we were all just tired commuters heading home? Had the woman with the paperback been watching me over the top of her book? Had the man in the reflective vest been studying me while I stared at my phone? Had they all been observing me night after night, waiting for something, waiting for me to notice? Because that's what had changed, wasn't it? I had noticed. I had started counting. I had started paying attention to who was there and who wasn't, and in doing so, I had separated myself from them. They were the uncounted, the unnoticed, the background, and I had pulled myself out of that background by the simple act of looking. The train stopped at a station. The doors opened. Cold air rushed in and mixed with the warm, thick atmosphere of the carriage. And for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, the cold air moved around the shapes of the things I couldn't see. I saw the negative space of them, the outlines where the air couldn't go, dozens of them, seated, standing, filling the carriage from end to end. The doors closed, the cold air dissipated, the outlines vanished. I rode the rest of the way home in silence. Their silence, my silence, the silence of a carriage full of people who have stopped needing to make sound. That was October. It's been months now. I still take the 11:47. I know, but I need the job and the archive needs someone on the late shift, and the train is the only way home. I've looked into alternatives. Buses, taxis, driving, but the routes don't work, or the cost is too high, or the timing is wrong. The 11:47 is the only option, and so I take it 5 nights a week, and I sit in my seat, and I ride home among them. Things have changed, though. Gradually, the way things change on this train. Not all at once, but in increments so small that you only notice them when you look back. The first change is that I've stopped being afraid. I don't know when it happened. It was sometime in November, I think. The fear just faded, the way pain fades if you sit with it long enough. It was replaced by something else, something I can only describe as familiarity. They're familiar to me now. The passengers I can't see. I know where they sit. I know the weight of them, the warmth of them, the way they shift slightly when the train takes a curve. I know them the way you know the furniture in your own home. By feel, by habit, by the space they take up. The second change is that I've stopped noticing new passengers. This took me a while to recognize. For a few weeks in November, there were occasionally visible passengers on the train. 1 or 2, never more. People I didn't recognize. People who looked tired and distracted and completely unaware of what they were sitting among. They'd ride for a few nights and then they'd be gone, not getting off at earlier stops. Just gone, absorbed, added to the invisible population. But in December, the new passengers stopped appearing. The train arrives, the doors open, the platform is empty except for me. I board, I sit down. The carriage is as full as it's ever been. Fuller, maybe. But I am the only visible person on the 11:47. I have been the only visible person for almost 4 months. The third change is the one I don't want to talk about, but I'm going to because I think I need to say it out loud, or whatever the equivalent of out loud is when you're just speaking into the dark and hoping someone is listening. My hands. I noticed it about 3 weeks ago. I was sitting on the train and I looked down at my hands, and the skin on the backs of them was smooth. Not dramatically smooth, not waxy, not artificial, just a little smoother than it should have been, a little less detailed. The small lines around my knuckles, the tiny creases at the base of each finger, they were softer than I remembered, blurred almost, as if someone had taken a very fine eraser and gently rubbed away the sharpest edges of my skin. I told myself it was the lighting. Fluorescent light does strange things to skin. Everyone knows that. You look worse in hospital lighting, and you look better in candlelight. And the lighting on the 11:47 is somewhere between the two, and it was playing tricks on me. But last week I looked at my hands in my kitchen, under the warm yellow light above the sink, and the smoothness was still there. It was more pronounced. My fingerprints were fainter than they should have been. Not gone, just faint, as if they were slowly being polished away. And I've been thinking about the older woman's hands, how smooth they were, how I'd described them as looking like wax. And I've been thinking about how she was one of the last visible passengers, how she was on the train every night, how she sat in her seat with her hands folded and never moved, and how one day she was simply gone. Not gone from the train, just gone from sight. I think about the process, whatever it is, however it works, whether it's something the train does to you or something you do to yourself by riding it often enough, by becoming part of its routine, by letting it become part of yours. I think about whether it's gradual, a slow erosion of visibility, a gentle fading, a long slide from being seen to being felt. I think about whether there's a moment when you cross the line, when you go from someone who can be seen to someone who can't, or whether it's more like falling asleep. A transition so smooth that you don't know it's happened until it's already done. I think about whether it hurts. I don't think it does. The passengers don't seem distressed. They sit in their seats and they ride the train, and they are calm and present and close. And whatever they are now, they don't seem to be suffering. They seem to be settled, content even, if that word applies to whatever they become. But I also think about the fact that I have never once heard one of them try to speak. Last night I sat in my seat and I closed my eyes and I let the rhythm of the train wash over me. And for just a moment, I forgot where I was. Not fell asleep. Forgot. The way you forget you're in a bathtub when the water is just the right temperature. The boundary between me and the train became soft. The vibration of the tracks moved through the seat and into my body, and I couldn't tell where the seat ended and I began. And the warmth of the invisible passengers around me was indistinguishable from my own warmth. And I was comfortable, deeply and completely comfortable. And it would have been so easy to stay there, to let the 42 minutes stretch into forever, to ride the 1147 through the dark, surrounded by familiar presences, until I was one of them. I opened my eyes at Hemel Hempstead. The automated voice said the name, and I opened my eyes and I stood up and I got off the train and I stood on the platform and I watched it pull away into the dark. But here's what I want to tell you. Here's the thing I can't stop thinking about. When I stood on the platform and watched the train leave, I saw myself. In the window of the second carriage, in the seat I'd just been sitting in, there was a shape. It was faint and dark, and it could have been a reflection. It could have been a trick of the glass. It could have been anything. But it was in my seat, and it was sitting exactly the way I sit. Head tilted, slightly left, shoulders sloped, hands in lap. It was sitting there as if it had never gotten up. I walked home. I got into bed. I looked at my hands. The fingerprints were almost gone. Tonight, I'll take the 1147 again. I'll tap my card and walk to the second carriage and sit in my seat among passengers I can't see and who can see me. And I'll ride home 42 minutes through the dark. I think about what happens when the last visible passenger disappears, when there's no one left for the train to show itself to, when every seat is full and the carriage is packed and the platform is empty, and the train pulls into Euston at 11:47 on a cold Tuesday night, and the doors open and no one gets on. Does it still run? Does the 1147 still make its journey, night after night, carrying a full load of invisible passengers to stops they never get off at? Does the automated voice still announce the stations to an audience that doesn't need to hear them? I think it does. I think it always has. I think the 1147 has been full for a very long time. I think I'm one of the newer ones. My stop is coming up. 2 more stations. I can feel the train beginning to slow. I can feel the passengers around me, all of them, settling in the way they always settle when the journey is almost over. Comfortable, patient, still. I'll get off at my stop. I'm almost sure I will. I'll stand up and walk to the doors and step onto the platform and watch the train leave. But I'll be honest with you. Each night, it's getting harder to stand up. Each night, the seat feels a little more like it was made for me. Each night, the space between me and the passengers around me gets a little thinner. And the idea of getting off, of breaking the rhythm, of leaving the warmth, of stepping out into the cold alone, feels a little more like something I used to do. Something I used to be the kind of person who did. My stop is next. I should stand up. I'm going to stand up.